I've never made it a secret that one of my biggest pleasures is watching professional wrestling. At this point, if you're a longtime listener of the show, you know this, and you just sort of run with it. If you're a newbie to the show, let me summarize my belief in the importance of pro wrestling like this. If you really want to understand the way the United States of America is the way it is today, for better or for worse, you gotta know a thing or two about the squared circle. That's industry lingo for a wrestling ring, for those who don't know. It's an unholy combination of athleticism, pomp and circumstance, and unvarnished and often celebrated narcissism. And it has bled into all aspects of the culture. Want to know where football stars and their celebratory antics after scoring a touchdown comes from? Pro wrestling and its posturing. Want to know where over-the-top antics, both good and bad, but especially bad, come from our public figures? The squared circle, my friend. Basically, the synthesis of pop culture in the U.S., coupled with the insanity of our 24-hour news cycle, mixed in with the obsession we hold towards professional athletics and sometimes amateur athletics, can run a straight line from here to the grappling giants of the early 20th century and pro wrestling. Now, normally, in making a claim like that, you gotta have a pretty strong case to back it up. Well, I can do you one better. I can not just only back up my case, I can take you to the man who didn't just popularize the idea of celebrity athlete, he might have invented the entire damn concept. And every larger-than-life persona we have in athletics, and even politics, can trace their roots back to this wild, wild man. I am, of course, talking about the toast of the coast, the sensation in the nation, the human orchid, George Wagner. But the world knew him as Gorgeous George. I'm Mike GW, and you're listening to Surreal Sports Stories. Alright, quick show of hands. How many of you have ever heard of the Gorgeous One? Okay, exactly what I thought. Nobody. Well, maybe outside of wrestling diehards, but I'm not guessing very many people. And that makes sense. Old Georgie's been passed away for almost 70 years now, and one can make the argument that he no longer clicks on the pop culture Q-score meter. Now that may be true, but that doesn't make him any less revolutionary. If anything, he is patient zero for the way things are today. Let me put it to you this way. He would absolutely have made Skip Bayless's head explode at least 15 different times if he was currently a star. But I digress. First, the beginnings. Gorgeous George was born George Wagner. Now I'm going to be frank with you. Gorgeous George was maybe the quintessential professional wrestler when it comes to writing about him. And by that, I mean that he was an incredible bullshitter. At his peak, George would give multiple interviews to major publications claiming that part of what made him good at getting reactions from the crowd was the fact that, in his own words, "I'm actually a trained psychologist." He claimed that this allowed him a keen mental and psychological advantage over the brutes, as he sneeringly referred to his in-ring opponents. This was all a lie. George didn't even finish high school. He barely even started high school, having dropped out at the age of 14. Frankly, the story of George Wagner, at least in the beginning, reads like the story of so many American boys who were born at the start of the 20th century. He was born March 24th, 1915, in Butte, not Butte, Nebraska. The oldest of three sons to Howard James Wagner and Bessie Mae Francis, George spent his early life bouncing around Nebraska, Iowa, and then finally Houston, Texas, where he would spend most of his childhood growing up. His family was poor, and by poor I mean his dad was a house painter with no record in the Houston Business Directory, which suggests that he was a by-contract guy, and a by-contract painter in the 1910s and 20s is not somebody who makes a lot of money. On top of that, when George was 6, his mother became ill, and she was rendered mostly bedridden for much of the rest of his and her life. Now, according to George's biographer, the author John Capoia, Bessie's condition had a significant impact on the boy and his development. In Capoia's book, Gorgeous George, the bad boy wrestler who created American pop culture, he wrote, quote, "As soon as he was able, George, the oldest, was charged with caring for his bedbound mother, feeding her, changing bandages, and emptying bedpans. He not only had to witness his mother's suffering and be utterly unable to relieve it, but was to some extent imprisoned by it." End quote. Oh, did I mention that George grew up in the late 1920s? Well, good thing there wasn't a major economic devastation coming around the corner to further inflict some trauma on the family, right? Oh, the Great Depression. The gift that just keeps on taking. When he wasn't caring for his ailing mother, young George was working whatever odd jobs he could to help support the family. And he wasn't doing that, he was just kicking it with his friends. Now, he and his childhood friends grew up in a rough neighborhood of Houston called Harrisburg, and before long, they all took to calling themselves the Harrisburg Rats. Yep, little Georgie was in a gang. And based on the research of Capoia, it seems more like one of those delightful old-timey groups of mischief-making miscreants we see in, I don't know, Annie or some other Depression-era films, instead of like the gangsters of Al Capone or even today. Now, the Harrisburg Rats spend most of their time messing with each other and roughhousing out on a patch of land just off the ship channel of Houston, where bootleggers allegedly made their illegal hooch to sell during Prohibition. And all of these boys loved pro wrestling. Much like kids in the 1990s who would jump off of couches like WWE superstar Jeff Hardy, George and his friends all wanted to be like the grappling legends of yesteryear. Names that kind of don't really have much significance today, but have all the significance in the world back then, like Frank Gotch and George Hackenschmidt, who are honestly on the Mount Rushmore of the history of pro wrestling, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, when they weren't wrestling, the boys were either gambling, trading wrestling cards, or gambling over trading wrestling cards. So this is all to say to the parents out there listening to this, if your kid likes WWE or AEW or anything else like that, all that means is that wrestling truly captures the imagination of children across all eras. It's kind of magical in a way. Now, it was here, screwing around with his friends, that George got his first taste of performing. And it turns out he was pretty good at it. According to Capoia's book, George's friend's father ran a fruit stand out in the bayou where nearby the dock workers would come and go to work. While the friend's dad was running the stand, George and company would, quote, wrestle off to one side in a pile of sawdust left by a former sawmill. The wilder their throws and the rougher their falls, George saw, the more coins passers-by would toss them. The more change that came clinking down, the more wrestling cards he could buy, or tickets to see Dizzy Dean, that's future MLB Hall of Famer Dizzy Dean, mind you, pitch, for the minor league baseball team, end quote. So at a young age, and during a time when money was scarce and life was hard, George Wagner was learning a valuable lesson. The way to make the most money was to be the biggest and most dramatic of them all. Anything less simply wouldn't be enough. Now, George and his friends, or at least a lot of them, would actually go on to be professional wrestlers when they grew up, but they didn't bring their love of wrestling to other official sporting events. They didn't wrestle in school, and they didn't play football or basketball, the other sports that young men of the time were encouraged to play if they weren't playing baseball. Any wrestling instruction that George and his buddies got was at the local YMCA, and George, while undersized, certainly had mighty strength. He was listed at 6'1" at his peak, but eyewitnesses and close friends and family had him at no taller than 5'9". Either way, learning the tricks of the trade in amateur wrestling would serve him very well. So keep that in mind. No matter what's going to happen in the future as we talk about him, know this: George Wagner could legitimately fight. Now, Wagner was never the biggest of the Harrisburg boys, but there was always something about him. A little je ne sais quoi, and maybe a little arrogance that would one day suit him well when he would one day become a household name. As he put it, quote, even as a boy, I didn't want to look like anybody else when I walked down the street. I wanted people to notice me, end quote. Makes sense, considering that he was growing up in the middle of, frankly, nowhere, and his family didn't have the same ambitions that he did. Well, at least his father didn't. Papa George Wagner is the definition of what Leonard Skinner would immortalize in their song Simple Man. Someone who takes their time, doesn't live too hard or too fast, and loves and supports their family. He seemed content to live his life and not make any bones about it or make any waves. He was content, perhaps. Or perhaps maybe he was trapped. Because while George Wagner Sr. was diffident and quiet, his wife Bessie was the opposite. Bedridden and prone to bursts of pain and mood swings, she was loving at times, but demanding all of the time. And because of her situation, coupled with the family's crushing poverty, she was difficult to be around. Difficult, but not impossible. Because Bessie really couldn't do much, little George had to meet her halfway. And so one of their main bonding activities was to thread and embroider together. For a young boy growing up in Depression-era America, threading and embroidering doesn't sound like the most exciting of things to do, or even something that we expect boys of that era to do at all. You know, because it's not manly. And yet George said the experience enchanted him, particularly when watching his mother work. It gave him an appreciation for the finer things, and as a teenager, he would keep an eye out for what he could one day afford. Years later, he remembered as a teenager, quote, "I used to stop in front of a clothing store and look at the suits in the window. They all looked drab, and I'd imagine that if I ever got money, I'd have them made up to my taste. Green and purple suits, black suits with white buttons, dark red, turquoise blue," end quote. It's not a stretch to think that, sitting on the bed with his mother, designing little yet beautiful, colorful things, the roots of the gorgeous one were beginning to take hold in young George Wagner's mind. But it wouldn't last. On October 8th, 1932, when George was only 14, his mother Bessie died. She was only 36 years old. She left behind a loving husband and 3 sons, one of whom was a devastated George. Bessie's death, as an aside, is one of history's great unfair what-ifs. She probably died of an infection that her compromised immune system couldn't fight off. And yet, if she had been alive in the 1940s, she almost certainly would have survived, because she would have been treated by the world's first antibiotic, penicillin. Yeah, that's right. Antibiotics weren't a thing until the World War II era. All this just to remind you that, turns out, a lot of the stuff we take for granted, pretty new developments. Anyway, from here, George was essentially untethered and unfettered. His mom is dead. He doesn't want to follow the footsteps of his father. He dreams of more. What is a young boy in a desperate time like this to do? Well, that's easy. Join the circus. Well, not exactly. See, in the 1930s, if you wanted to watch wrestling of any type, you usually had to go to the carnival shows in the circus nearby to see those shows off to the side. And they were hardly the overproduced cultural phenomena that professional wrestling today like WWE possesses. They were dingy, sloppy, and crooked affairs, and carnival barkers would try their best to draw in any passerby. As Gorgeous George's biographer John Capuia wrote, barkers would usually cry out things like, quote, "Okay, ladies and gentlemen, trot on down here. Come see live professional wrestling. These are bone-crushing men who are famous all over the world." This was the hook for the exhibition wrestling, in which 2 carnies took on each other. What drew in George, though, were the challenge matches. "Okay, you tough guy out there," this barker shouted. "Let's see if any of you can stay in the ring with our man. It only costs a quarter to try, and if you can last for 5 minutes, we'll give you $5. Yeah, you over there with the pretty girl hanging on your arm, you think you're man enough. What about you, farm boy? You can push those cows around. Why don't you step up here and try pushing a man around? Who'll raise their hand?" End quote. Sorry to get into the spirit of it there, but that's kind of the vibe. And in order to sell things, there'd always be someone in the crowd who was in on the bit who would raise their hand and agree to take on the performers in the ring. This ringer would get in the ring and, to the shock of any passerby, beat the big burly fighters in the ring, and then pocket $5. Now you have a potential crowd of suckers, which is to say, marks, who think that, hey, I could do that too. And now you can draw some money. Now there was an art to this simulated violence. As Capuia wrote, quote, The carny wrestlers were grown men and tough. Most of the yokels, the local farm boys or oil riggers, were no threat. The carny's goal, and the true art involved here, was to beat the mark while convincing him he'd barely lost and could win a rematch, or to entice his friend looking on to step up with what he thought was a real shot at revenge. The crowd naturally took the side of the locals, and some could even be enticed to bet their loyalties against other carnies, salted in among the paying customers." End quote. This was the world that George Wagner, at the time a teenager and barely 170 pounds, and again, still only 5'9", wanted to enter. Amazingly, he took to the game pretty quickly. According to some published reports, he even managed to win a few times, even with the odds stacked against him. In one match that went an excruciating 7 minutes long, George managed to pin the in-house brawler and pocketed a couple dollars for his efforts. But when George saw his YMCA wrestling coach in attendance and went up to him after the show to say hello, his coach spurned him. "You're not an amateur anymore," the coach said. "You're a professional." Bit of a dickish thing to say to a kid who's figuring out something that he's good at and making some money at it that his family probably desperately needed during the Great Depression, but whatever, bro. And it's not like little George was winning in a, well, shall we say, entirely on the level sporting contest. This probably doesn't come as a shock, but the men who engaged in a simulated contest where they were trying to sucker the paying public also had some tricks of the trade to make absolutely sure that no mark was going to get one over on them if they got in the ring. Consider this hypothetical. Let's say you're in the ring with the in-house wrestler and there's a referee and you believe that this is all on the up and up. You square up with the dude and you get him in a collar and shoulder tie-up, which is just a fancy way of saying that you and the other guy are grappling at each other's shoulders and arms to gain leverage. And it feels like you might actually be stronger than him. You might actually win. But now the man puts you in a headlock and you feel an excruciating pain in your eye. That's because while the in-house wrestler merely looks like he's just got you in a regular headlock that is totally legal in wrestling, he's also sticking one of his knuckles in your eye. You scream to the referee, but he's also in on it. He's not saying anything. Finally, the pain is too much, and you put your hands up to your face to save your eye from being caved in. And that's when this cheating two-faced son of a gun sweeps your leg like the Karate Kid and pins you for a 3 count. The ref calls you a loser, and you get your ass tossed out of the ring. Sorry, bud. Better luck next time. And congratulations, you just got suckered. Because even when you think you've got it, the game was rigged from the start. Again, this is the world that George Wagner would start out in. And it was a world that he grew to love. And more importantly, it was one where he started to stand out. In those shabby carnival rings in front of a few dozen people at a time, little George Wagner started to learn all of the tricks. And he learned the most important rule of this burgeoning business. The most important thing that you can do is be the center of attention. For a young man who craved that his whole life, this probably felt like manna from heaven. As John Capuya wrote, quote, "He'd never felt anything like this, and he responded like a born performer. The crowd's reactions fired warmth in his gut that spread through his whole body. He'd act out more, louder, throw his body around even harder. The teenage girls, young brides and mothers in their 20s, women who usually had to be dragged into the wrestling tents by their dates and husbands, seemed to scream louder when young Wagner was in the ring, the carny operators noticed. The laborers in overalls and office workers in straw hats and linen sport coats bet more heavy, both for and against him." End quote. He was, as they say in the business, beginning to draw. And he was entering the business at the best possible time for his soon-to-be perfect skill set. See, this might come as a shock, but pro wrestling is fake. Well, that's not fair. That's not fair at all, actually. The performers are putting their body through the ringer, and they are performing some incredible feats of athleticism and power and finesse and speed. But the thing is, the outcomes of their matches were decided ahead of time. They all know before they walk out of the curtain in front of the crowd exactly what the finish is going to be. Now, if you've listened to this podcast long enough, you know my fanhood for this business and you know that I don't care. And frankly, neither should any of us. It's good entertainment if you know what you're getting into. But except at the start of the 20th century, it really wasn't all that entertaining even with the knowledge that it was faked. Consider this write-up of wrestling from before 1910 describing the state of the big business. Quote, before 1910 or so, promoters usually offered just the main event and one prelim with local boys. To create a full evening's amusement, they needed the main event to last 2 hours or more, and a truly contested match ran the risk of ending in minutes. In one infamous encounter between Ed Strangler Lewis and Joe Stechter, the first fall took 2 hours, and the third went 4, the whole match lasting longer than a baseball doubleheader. Worse, in entertainment terms, for much of that time the two wrestlers were lying around inert with one in the other's headlock. End quote. Now, even though promoters tried to convince fans that this was entertainment, I, as a diehard pro wrestling fan, will be the first to tell you that that sounds absolutely excruciating to watch. Basically, the only people who were excited to watch these extended nap times were the gamblers who were betting on the outcome. So in desperation, the main wrestling business started looking to the carnivals for ideas to, well, frankly, steal. After all, quote, feigned violence in which both opponents know what's coming can be much more high-flying and spectacular than the real unpredictable thing, and therefore dangerous thing. Promoters also put time limits on matches and hired more wrestlers to fill their bills. Afterward, legitimate bouts existed only to settle personal scores, and these happened in private. They were called shooting matches, or just shoots, and the ones with predetermined outcomes were working matches, or works. The boys were also called workers, and being called a good worker was high industry praise. End quote. And in this new paradigm, it should probably be no surprise that the method of measuring success would change as well, too. Winning and losing, in and of itself, was starting to become secondary to the new, more important aspect of wrestling, and that aspect was getting heat, or drawing a reaction from the fans. You might not never actually win a match, but if you could get the fans to care about you, and, more importantly, get them to care about you and pay to see you, then you, my friend, had a future in this business. Not that anyone could know this on the outside, anyway. As this business started to evolve and change, wrestlers evolved a sort of code language to protect the nature of the industry that was overall known as kayfabe, and it was rigidly and sometimes psychotically protected. That's another podcast episode in and of itself, but I will simply say that at the time, few would be better at protecting the business than George Wagner. Years after he made it big as the Gorgeous One, he was asked by a news reporter if the business was fixed. George's response? A rather hissy, quote, "You might also ask me if I enter false income tax returns or if I beat my wife. To the best of my knowledge, I have never engaged in any fraudulent bout. Everybody in there is trying to kill me." End quote. Did you catch that? He added in that little qualifier, "to the best of my knowledge." That means that even if there was a fixed match, he can claim that he had no idea about it. Oh, plausible deniability. One of kayfabe's best friends. Now here's the thing. George Wagner was never going to make a living in the wrestling business just by playing at his local carnival for the rest of his life. And so, in 1936, he left home with a few of his other friends who wanted to make it big as wrestlers and went down to Atlanta in an effort to make it big. His father, George Sr., was understandably upset. Quote, "Don't go, George," he pleaded. "It's a hard game to get into. You'll be home in a month, broke and all beat up. Stay here and come into the painting business with me." End quote. George Jr., however, simply did not want to live a life that started and ended in obscurity. He wanted to be more. Except when he went down to Atlanta, he damn nearly got killed. It turns out that in a business as secretive and suspicious of outsiders as wrestling, anyone that wanted to break into the business proper was gonna get hazed like a freshman rushing from a college fraternity. George constantly got beaten up, legitimately, in the ring by his opponents. And it's not like he could say anything, because otherwise he'd be called a wussy and been thrown out of the business. And the deck was also rigged against him in a more metaphoric sense, too. Quote, "Most of the work he got was out of my class," he said, meaning that he, a light heavyweight, was matched with much bigger opponents. They'd smother him and make it tougher for him to show his stuff the way he could with a faster man. More significantly, the local promoters weren't giving him much of a build-up. Most nights he was in the openers, and once the promoters and fans start to think of you as a prelim boy or underneath boy, since you were at the bottom of the cards, he knew it's hard to change their minds. End quote. And that was basically everything that he looked like he was going to be. Though George had a natural talent at the pro wrestling game, he wasn't the only one like that. Good-looking guys with some athleticism and some style were a dime a dozen. And while George Wagner was regionally popular with some of the German immigrant communities in the areas he traveled to, because his last name is Wagner, like Wagner, German, get it? That's not the type of thing that was going to make him the living that he craved. And George Wagner didn't want to be one of the boys. He wanted to be something much more than that. As he remembered it years later, quote, "The only thing that kept me from hitchhiking back was what my father said to me, that I wouldn't make it as a wrestler." End quote. But for the life of him, he couldn't seem to figure out what it would take to break through. As it so happens, he was going to need a little help. And he would get that help very, very soon. Because while George Wagner might have had a latent woman's touch, he would need the help of the real deal to take the next step. He would need the help of his wife. Next time on Surreal Sports Stories, George Wagner meets the woman who would change his life, his career, and the course of professional wrestling itself. And in doing so, he would set himself on a course to superstardom and self-destruction. Sources for today's episodes include CNN.com, Sports Illustrated, HistoryOfWrestling.com, TheSportster.com, and John Capoya's excellent biography of Gorgeous George entitled Gorgeous George, the outrageous bad boy wrestler who created American pop culture. If you like the show, you can find Surreal Sports Stories wherever you listen to your podcasts. Do us a favor and smash that subscribe button and leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to your shows. It really helps the podcast grow. You can also find me, your intrepid host, Mike GW, on Blue Sky at thewritingirishman.bsky.social and Instagram and Threads at MikeGWComedy. Again, I'm on Blue Sky at thewritingirishman.bsky.social and on Instagram and Threads is at MikeGWComedy. Oh, don't worry, I'll put all of those links in the show notes for you too. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. This has been Surreal Sports Stories, you've been amazing, and I've been Mike GW. Stay steady, y'all.